The first time they saw her hammering rough sawn pine planks onto the side of her cabin, straight across the windows, swallowing up the walls like a second skin, Caleb Martin told the others she'd finally lost her mind. "This is what happens when a woman's left too long alone," he said, squinting at the slope of the roof she'd extended outward, covering the cabin like a mother hen might shield her chicks. "She starts boarding up her own home like a coffin." They chuckled around the whiskey jug, leaning on their shovels, pretending not to watch too hard as the widow in the valley below hauled another load of lumber down from the slope with her mule cart. Her boys, just two of them left now, maybe 10 and 12, trailed her like shadows, each dragging a bundle of cut twigs and branches longer than they were tall. It was the fall of '71, and though the leaves were just turning, everyone could feel the warning in the wind. The past summer had been dry, mean, and spiteful. The river was low, the animals lean. Word from Fort Laramie said the weather was turning strange back east, and that meant it'd find its way here soon enough. But nobody expected what was coming. Least of all the widow. Her name was Ruth Haverson, 32, a face like weathered linen, smooth but tight-trapped with years of silence. Her husband Emil had died 2 winters before, struck through the belly by a falling branch while chopping kindling in a snowstorm. He bled out trying to crawl back to the cabin, his tracks half covered when Ruth found him. She deburied him beneath the oak just behind the house, then kept going like nothing had changed. Which maybe, for a woman like her, nothing had. She was one of those made of different stock, Norwegian blood, or maybe just plain cold metal. She had no kin nearby, no man to help raise the boys, and no money to pay hands. What she had was 1 mule, 2 children, a stovepipe that smoked like clockwork, and now, apparently, a plan to turn her cabin into a box inside another box. "What's she doin'?" someone asked on the 3rd day. Caleb just spat and said, "Dyin' indoors, I reckon." But Ruth wasn't boarding herself in, not exactly. What she was building looked, from a distance, like a shed grafted right onto her cabin. But as the weeks passed, it grew around every wall. A low-ceilinged outer room, not quite a porch, not quite a barn, just a long, narrow hallway of planks enclosing the original log house. It wrapped all 4 sides, stopping only where the stone chimney rose up from the back wall. No one in town had ever seen anything like it. And no one offered to help. They were too busy trying to finish their own winter prep, stacking hay, patching roofs, digging cellars. Everyone knew this winter might be bad, and no one had the luxury to worry about the woman who thought her cabin needed a coat. But come the 3rd week, folks started talking again, quietly and with a little less laughter, because Ruth wasn't just building a shell, she was filling it. The boys hauled in more than wood. They stacked stone, brought in dry moss, dragged burlap sacks stuffed with straw. Ruth herself chopped cedar limbs into bundles and hung them from hooks along the rafters. She sealed every seam with mud and pitch, then layered more boards over that. The smell of pine, sap, smoke, and sweat drifted out from that strange new room like a slow-burning incense. And in the middle of it all, the thing that made Caleb pause his sneering for the first time. She lined the entire north side of that shed within a cabin with firewood. Not just a stack, an entire wall of it. Oak, birch, some cottonwood, cut precisely, bark split and bone dry. She must have been gathering it since summer's end. It was enough to last 3 families twice over. But no one said anything to her face. The older folks nodded politely if they passed her at the trading post. The younger ones looked away. It was only old Sadie Jerwin, who ran the tannery out by Rock Creek, who had the nerve to ask. "You expectin' company this winter?" she said as Ruth hoisted a sack of flour into her cart. Ruth just blinked once slow. "No, ma'am." "You fortifyin' for siege then?" Ruth glanced toward her boys. They were watching 2 ravens fight over a piece of lard beside the well. "No." "Then what in heaven's name are you building?" Ruth hesitated. Then she said, "A place where cold don't get in." Sadie snorted. You can't stop the cold, girl, you just ride it out. Ruth's eyes didn't move. You can if you keep it outside. That was all. By December, the valley had turned white. The first storm came early, dropped 3 feet in one night, and snapped a dozen roofs in half. The Martin family lost half their sheep to exposure. The Dwyers, baby near froze when their chimney cracked and spilled smoke into the rafters. And over in the hollow, Ruth's cabin smoked as steadily as ever. Not once did she come to town for more firewood. By New Year's, everyone else had run through their stacks. Moist logs hissed in iron stoves, and men cursed the mold that made them burn slow. But Ruth's fire never faltered. Her shed, strange and narrow as it was, kept the logs dry, warmer even. The wind never reached them. The snow couldn't touch them. And every log she burned inside her home had been aged and protected for weeks in that wooden shell. Her cabin stayed warm enough that she was seen once drying laundry on a line out back, in February. And for the first time in memory, her children didn't come down with croup. By March the laughter had stopped. Now there were questions. And by April there were copies. Half a dozen homes in the valley began adding storm sheds. Men patched on extra rooms, built lean-tos, even tried burying wood in pits, but it wasn't the same. Their logs had already been soaked. Their roofs still leaked. They didn't understand. Ruth hadn't just stored firewood. She made a wall of it, insulated herself with it, used it as shield and fuel both. It was a defense against the one enemy they all forgot to fear until too late: damp. And it wasn't just her firewood that stayed dry. She did too. Even when the last snowmelt crept down from the ridge and soaked half the valley, Ruth's cabin stayed bone warm. She never said, "I told you so," never bragged, never explained. But come the following fall, when the air turned crisp again, Caleb Martin was seen nailing planks onto the side of his own cabin, slow, awkward, silent. And Ruth, she just kept splitting more wood. The ground thawed, but the lessons from that long winter did not. April brought meltwater and the stench of rot, cellars that had flooded, straw mattresses soaked through, trunks of winter clothes gone mildew-spotted beyond saving. And in the middle of it all, Ruth Haverson's cabin stood dry as an old hymn book. The snow had piled high that winter, heavy as a curse. But the strange wooden sleeve she'd built around her home had held its own, shed it off, kept the wind at bay, dried her firewood, dried her boots, kept her boys warm and unsick for the first time in 2 years. No one came to say thank you, but they watched her closer now. By the first week of May, she was out early with an axe again, cutting down the smaller trees along the frozen edge of the creek, ones the others would have waited till late summer to fell. Her sons, Lucas and Eli, moved like two practiced ghosts behind her. Lucas, older, now carried a hatchet and wore his father's old scarf like it meant something. Eli, younger and more squirrel-boned, was quieter, often dragging fallen limbs alone while Ruth cleared the path ahead. They worked in long shifts, chopped, split, stacked. Ruth never looked toward the hills anymore, where the Martin homestead lay half-buried in melting slush. She didn't glance up at the ridge where the Dwyers were now putting up a makeshift shed, crooked and barely tacked together. She didn't speak at all unless it was to give her boys instructions. She just worked. And what she built next made the neighbors murmur all over again. Because Ruth didn't just refill her shed. She doubled it, extended it, used the same method: planks, pitch, moss caulking, straw fill, but this time she didn't wrap it close to the cabin's skin. She stepped out several feet, built what almost looked like a hallway with a second roof, like a cloister, like the shell of a fortress. By June, her cabin had grown twice its width. A ring of space, insulated and dry, wrapped all around it, just tall enough to walk through, just wide enough to stack cordwood on either side. People said she was building a coffin again. But Caleb Martin's shed had already collapsed in the late spring winds, so he wasn't saying much. The town's preacher, Reverend Alden, came by one morning with a jar of gooseberry preserves as a gift and an excuse. Said he was checking on the moral health of the valley's more isolated families. Ruth didn't answer the door. Her son Lucas did. "She's workin'." "Well," the Reverend had said, awkward, "perhaps just a moment." Lucas didn't move. A few seconds later, Ruth's voice came from somewhere behind the door. "Let the man speak." So he did. He praised her strength, her fortitude, her example, but the compliments grew thin after a few sentences, replaced by a slow, circling question. "But don't you think it's time, perhaps, to seek more fellowship?" Silence. Ruth stepped out from the side of the shed, gloves stained black with sap, her sleeves soaked, hair damp with sweat. "I got fellowship," she said. "Where, Ruth?" She glanced toward her boys, then at the wall of wood rising behind them. "Right here." The Reverend cleared his throat. "The good book says." "I know what it says. It also says a wise woman builds her house." He opened his mouth again, but Ruth turned and walked back to her work, calling over her shoulder, "You want to help stack, grab a log. Otherwise don't block the light." The jar of preserves was left on the porch. She never opened it. By the end of July, the Haverson cabin looked less like a homestead and more like a bulwark. Neighbors coming to trade at the mercantile passed by on horseback, slowing instinctively when they came in view of her little valley. Some whispered that she was preparing for war. Others said she'd gone off guard. But the quietest ones, the oldest settlers, the ones who remembered the freeze of '57, the flood of '63, the windstorm that had pulled a roof clean off a schoolhouse, those people just nodded and said, "She knows what's common. You can feel it in your bones." And they weren't wrong. Because the summer turned strange. The sun beat down too long. Clouds came but left no rain. The river dropped lower than anyone had seen since the first settlers crossed that bend in '49. Crops turned pale, then gold, then brown, then brittle. Chickens laid less. Cows grew lean. Wells that had run clear all spring started burping up sand and iron-stained water by August. People began whispering the old word. Drought. They tried not to say it out loud. Because in the West, drought didn't mean just heat. It meant sickness. It meant rot. It meant dry grass that turned to fire at the first lightning strike. It meant game that vanished and crops that crumbled and winds that stole your roof in one breath and left you coughing through dust for months after. And it meant one more thing. The worst kind of winter. Because when the water was wrong, the land didn't freeze right. The snow came wet, then dry, then wet again. Ice turned brittle and sharp, and nothing burned clean when your wood had been soaked and dried and soaked again. Your stove would hiss like a snake. Your chimney would clog, and if you hadn't planned for it, really planned, you'd be dead by February. But Ruth had planned. And she didn't just have wood this time. She had kindling, sorted by size, bone dry, stacked in drawers and barrels and crates and even old feed sacks. She had insulation, layer after layer of burlap, sheep wool, straw, and pine branches pinned to the inside of her shed walls like patchwork. She had trapdoors in the floor of her porch, little shelves built into the roof line, slots behind the chimney bricks where she tucked small fire starters. She turned her cabin into a living stove, a dry-bellied, breath-warm, cold-proof machine. And her neighbors watched in silence now. No more laughing. But still no one asked for help. Until the wind came. It came late September, sudden and violent, like a freight wagon crashing through the hills. Not a storm, not yet. Just a breath from the north that blew 3 roofs crooked, knocked down a chimney in town, and sent half the men scrambling to lash their firewood stacks with twine and canvas. But not Ruth. Her wood didn't move. Not even when the second wind hit a week later, harder, colder, whistling down from the ridge like a cry from something old and hungry. Caleb Martin came by after that one, not proud, not friendly, but quiet. He stood outside her fence and waited. Ruth stepped out, wiping her hands on a rag. He looked at her wall of firewood, at the neat double rows of split logs wrapped in bark and lined with cedar, all dry and sealed and tucked behind a second wall of planks. "I got wet wood," he said finally. Ruth nodded. "I can trade you." She didn't say yes. Didn't say no. Just studied him. "You laughed," she said, not angry, just stating a fact. "I was wrong." Still, she didn't speak. "I'll cut for you. Bring my son. We'll clear that back lot you got where the pine started creeping up again." She looked at him another moment, then nodded once. "Dry it by the creek," she said. "Not near the cabin, not this time." And just like that, the first man in the valley began working for her. Others followed. The Dwyers sent over one of their daughters with a basket of smoked meat and a request for plans to build a shed like hers. The preacher came again, this time with his sleeves rolled and a hammer in hand. By November, half the valley had copycat sheds rising like strange tumors off their cabins. None were as tight, none were as layered, but they tried. And Ruth, she finished her ring. Laid one final path of stone from the cabin's rear wall to the buried root cellar and enclosed that too. A tunnel, warm, windless. The cold couldn't touch it. And then she stopped building. Let the others watch. And waited. Because she knew the worst had not come yet. It came without warning, like the Lord's own reckoning. The morning of December 4th began calm. Frost glazed the panes of every cabin. A hush had settled on the valley, the kind that made even the birds wait in silence. The sky wore a flat gray plate of cloud, unmoving and unbroken, and the wind had stopped entirely, as if holding its breath. Ruth Haverson stood by the shed's back entrance, lifting her arm to test the stillness. She could feel the weight in the air, not rain, not snow, just pressure. Her mule was twitchy. The boys were quiet. Eli kept looking toward the ridge like he expected something to crest it. That night it began. A soundless snow falling straight down in sheets, steady and terrifying in its indifference. No flurries, no wind, just a solid curtain of white. It covered the valley like ash. Within 6 hours the fences were buried. Within 12 doors were blocked. By morning the settlement had all but disappeared beneath it. Those who had stoves burning through the night were the lucky ones. Their chimneys stayed open, smoke curled steadily skyward. Those who'd let their fires die to save wood, thinking they'd rekindle in the morning, woke to silence and dark and frozen chimneys sealed with packed snow. And worse, most of them had firewood that wouldn't catch. Because when the storm hit, it came wet. The first 12 hours soaked everything before the deep freeze set in. Logs that had been left under canvas or tarps grew slick, useless. Kindling turned to mush. Matches snapped before they lit. Ruth's cabin glowed like a lantern in the storm. Inside it was warm, not hot, but steady. A thick, breathable warmth, like the inside of a root cellar or a barn that's been lived in for generations. The shed's double walls hadn't just stopped the cold, they'd slowed it, blocked the wind, kept every log dry. Lucas and Eli worked shifts through the night feeding the stove. They used the small stuff first, thin cedar slivers, pine cones, twigs wrapped in wax. Ruth had taught them to prioritize. Keep the kindling small and dry. Don't waste the thick oak until you're sure the burn is clean. Shut the flue when the wind whistles. Always keep 2 burns ahead. They'd practiced it like drills in autumn. Now they did it silently, efficiently, in the hush of that buried cabin, where the windows were shuttered tight behind 2 layers of timber and resin cloth. Ruth stood watch by the side tunnel. It led from the back corner of the cabin to the old root cellar, a place most families only visited in spring when the ground softened again. But she'd prepped it through fall, laying cedar chips, patching leaks, reinforcing the slope. Now it was their best store of cured meat, hard cheese, dried apples, jars of lard. She checked it every few hours, because she didn't trust the storm to stay polite. And she was right. By the third day, snow lay higher than a man's chest. Roofs sagged. Smoke disappeared into white silence. Wind had returned, slicing through the valley like a knife, hard enough to bend pine trees. Drifts began pushing against walls, finding seams, turning every home into a buried tomb. Except one. Ruth's cabin shed hadn't been an afterthought. It had been engineered. The shed roof had a slope, angled away from the main roof so snow slid off rather than piled up. The eaves had been reinforced. The walls were double-framed, with slats for expansion, allowing the weight of snow to press without collapsing the whole. The chimney had a simple tin hood, a repurposed stovepipe cut and wired to catch and split falling snow, keeping the flue open even as the storm buried everything else. On the fourth day, they heard the first knock. Faint, hesitant. Eli, startled, dropped a kindling bundle. Ruth stood, listened. Then she moved to the narrow front corridor where the original cabin door was recessed deep inside the new shed. She cracked open the outer door and found a pale shape collapsed against the planks. Sadie Jerwin. The tanner. Half frozen, fingers stiff, one boot gone, her hair coated in frost. Ruth dragged her in without a word. She stripped the woman's coat, pulled a blanket around her, fed her broth as she trembled on the floor near the stove. She left her house 2 days ago, Sadie finally whispered. Stove cracked, smoke backed up, the dogs froze first. Ruth said nothing, just handed her another blanket and added a piece of dry pine to the fire. By dusk 2 more came. The Dwyer's oldest son carrying his sister, no older than 5, barely conscious. Their father had gone out for wood and never come back. Their own fire had been out for a full day. Ruth let them in. She made no speeches, no sermons. Just cleared space, fed them hot water with molasses, dried their clothes. She pulled up extra bedding, made the boys shift their blankets to the side corridor. You'll sleep in the shed wall tonight, she told them. Warmer there. Lucas nodded. He already knew. By day 6, 10 people were in the cabin. Some crawled in, others were dragged. No one asked why she'd built the shed anymore. They only asked for heat. And Ruth gave it. But not for free. You carry wood, she said to the preacher, who arrived barely upright with one hand burned from a bad fire start. You bring it from the south wall, stack it back after you pull. No gaps. To Caleb Martin's wife, who wept openly when her husband didn't return from trying to clear the flue, you help sort the pine cones from the cedar. We need clean burn to boil water. To the Dwyer's daughter, now awake but coughing, you sweep the ash out, not too much. We keep a base in the pan, helps hold heat. Everyone had a task. No one resisted. Because no one else had a fire. And because Ruth didn't weep, didn't beg, didn't promise. She just acted. And in the doing they followed. By day 8, the snow was beginning to shift. Not melt, just shift. Wind pushed it hard against the hills. One of the outbuildings down by the river was found flattened. The Martins' cellar had caved. Someone said you could see the tip of a stovepipe poking up like a gravestone from a drift, but no one knew who it belonged to. Inside Ruth's cabin, the air stayed dry and warm. Food was tight, but she'd prepared. Dried beans, lard, crushed oats. She rationed, measured by the ladle, not the bowl. No one complained. One night, while stirring a pot of snowmelt and jerky, Sadie asked quietly, "How'd you know?" Ruth didn't look up. "I didn't," she said. "Then why?" Ruth paused. "Because the cold don't care if you believe in it or not. It just comes." Sadie nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "Your husband, he didn't die in vain." Ruth turned the ladle again. "He died cold, that's all I remember." Silence followed. Not reverent, just real. By day 10, when the winds began to ease and the first shaft of light cracked through the upper wall, showing a blue sky beyond the storm clouds, Ruth opened the front door for the first time. Snow had hardened like stone. She carved a path with her shovel, the handle wrapped in wool, and stepped out into silence. Not a soul stirred across the valley. Just her cabin, breathing smoke. And the long, dry wall of wood that hadn't shifted an inch. She debuilt a coffin, they'd said. But it was never that. It was a womb. A haven. A small, stubborn world in which no one froze. Not this time. Not under her roof. The sun did not return all at once. It was a thin thing at first, just a pale rim creeping along the ridge like a memory of warmth. After 11 days beneath the storm, Ruth's valley emerged in silence, dazed and blanketed in white so thick it swallowed every fence post and road marker, every boot track, wagon rut and cellar entrance. Chimneys poked from the snow like breathless mouths. Smoke was rare. The day after the wind stopped, Ruth rose early. Her shoulders ached. Her fingers, stiff from cold and overuse, shook as she adjusted the stove's damper. In the corner, Sadie Jerwin stirred under blankets. The preacher sat nodding near the hearth, half asleep, his head drooped toward a pot of warming water. Lucas and Eli were already up, crouched at the tunnel hatch leading toward the root cellar, checking the frost buildup on the latch. The door was sealed tight. No snow seeped through. Ruth had packed clay along the seams back in September. They had survived. But Ruth knew that surviving the storm was not the same as surviving the aftermath. Because snow melts. And when it does, everything changes. She stepped into the shed's outer corridor and pulled on her boots, now hardened into a permanent curl at the toe from proximity to the stove. She wrapped her scarf, tied her coat, and grabbed the snow paddle she'd fashioned from a wooden crate lid and an old hoe handle. "Lucas," she called not loud. He looked up. "Come." They dug together, out through the front corridor, then up, straight toward the light that filtered through the narrow gap between the shed roof and the heavy snow above. The snowpack was dense, layers compressed under their own weight, but it had begun to crust on top. They worked in shifts. Lucas took turns with Eli. Ruth rested between pulls. No one else offered. They knew better. It wasn't that Ruth refused help, only that she moved with a purpose no one wanted to interrupt. By noon, they broke through. A shaft of sunlight stabbed into the corridor like a blade. The moment it touched Ruth's face, her lips parted, not in surprise but recognition. Like something she'd expected had finally arrived. She widened the hole, dug a channel out and over the outer ring of her shed. Then slowly, carefully, she stepped up and out of the trench, emerging onto a crusted surface that reached as high as the midpoint of her window shutters. The air was sharp, burned the lungs, but it was clean. And it was quiet. So quiet she could hear the distant crackle of something shifting above the ridge. A tree, perhaps, collapsing under its own weight. Ruth turned slowly, scanning the valley. What she saw made her breath catch. Not from fear, but from confirmation. There were no fences anymore. No wagons. The Dwyer's roof had collapsed inward, just a square depression in the snow now. The Martin place was gone, buried clean. Only a few thin tendrils of smoke rose in the distance, from cabins that had stayed lit, or stoves barely holding on. And hers roared. From the chimney behind her, a thick, dark ribbon of smoke rose clean and strong, curling upward toward the blue like a defiant cry. Behind her, voices stirred, children whispering, the preacher coughing, someone shifting in their sleep. They were alive. All of them. And they had wood left. Ruth crouched, swept snow from the vent she'd left along the shed's eaves, and called back down into the trench. "Clear the south stack. We're burning pine tonight, cedars next." Lucas's voice came up. "Aye." She moved to the west side and dug out a wedge near the base, exposing the outer layer of the firewood wall. It was dry. She knocked a log free and caught the fresh, sharp scent of cedar heartwood. Her hands, though red with cold, didn't tremble. The wind had passed. Now came the flood. By the third day after the storm ended, snowmelt had begun. It didn't trickle, it surged. Drifts slumped and shifted. Cornices collapsed from ridgelines. Water pooled where roofs sagged. Mud spread like ink over hard-packed trails. Root cellars, long forgotten beneath the snow, began to drown. At Ruth's cabin, the runoff did not enter. She dug shallow trenches along the outer perimeter of the shed, then deeper cuts around the back slope toward the old stone basin that once served as a watering hollow for deer. The water followed these channels. She watched it with her boys, watched as it turned from ice to trickle to stream. Caleb Martin's boy, Evan, came by on the fifth day. He stood outside the trench, wet to the thighs, face drawn and wind-chapped. "We can't dry anything," he said. "The stove's out again." Ruth stood by the shed's corner, arms crossed. "Your shed collapse." He nodded. "Firewood soaked." Another nod. "You carrying a blade?" He drew a hatchet from his belt. She pointed toward the east end of her property. "There's a birch grove, take the bark. Dry it near your fire, it'll catch." "I know, we tried." "Then try harder." He didn't move. After a moment she added, "Take some twigs from my south wall, just enough to start. Bring a rope, bundle it right." He didn't speak, but his eyes brimmed. "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me, burn it clean." Evan ran. The next morning, 2 more children arrived. Then a mother with an infant. Then Sadie left, determined to bring her cousin from the far side of the ridge. It became a relay. Ruth's cabin, her strange, wrapped, fireproofed cabin, became a note of heat in a valley gone brittle and blue. She rationed carefully. Measured every log. Every sliver. 4 pieces per stove fill, she told Lucas. "No more, let it burn down, scrape the ash, keep it breathing." Word spread. Not from her mouth. From smoke. People followed the smoke. And from the ones who reached her first, she learned the truth of what had happened beyond her stretch of woods. 3 cabins had collapsed. 2 had burned, chimneys blocked, fire reversed. 1 man, someone's uncle from the southern ridge, had been found face down in the snow, still clutching a soaked matchbook in one hand. And all of them had laughed. All of them had sneered in October, when she boarded up her windows again. Called her a widow building her own tomb. Now their children crouched by her stove and slept under quilts she'd patched in silence. One night after the others had settled, Lucas asked her, "Did you know this would happen?" Ruth stirred the pot, the wooden spoon slow in her hand. "No. But you built like you did." She looked up at him, something shifting behind her eyes. "I built like I couldn't afford to be wrong." Lucas nodded and didn't ask again. By mid-January, the cabin was still standing. Still dry. The shed, warped and frostbitten in places, held fast. 1 beam had begun to split, and Ruth patched it with pine pitch and canvas. The stove smoked steady. And every night more came. Not all stayed. But all came. By the end of the month, 22 people had warmed themselves by her fire. Ruth didn't count them aloud. She counted the logs. She knew how long each cord lasted. How long each batch of stew stretched. She made it work. To the paper. To the church. She declined. But the story traveled. of the widow who built a shed around her cabin, of the woman who carried more than firewood. She carried 26 souls through the deepest winter anyone could remember, and never lost a one. In the following year, sheds sprang up all across the ridge. Not one was mocked. They called them Haverson shells. They built them wide, tall, sometimes even elegant. But none were as strong. Because Ruth S. wasn't born from cleverness. It came from refusal. Refusal to let the cold win again. And in the silence that followed the thaw, in the hush between seasons, the valley held its breath. Waiting, but not afraid. Because now they had firewood. They had patience. And they had Ruth Haverson's example. A woman who didn't laugh, didn't cry, didn't boast. She just built, and burned, and lived.